Welcome, everybody. Let's talk real estate. Your weekly BS with Barry Saywitz about the current commercial real estate market here in Southern California. As we take a no BS look at both sides of the issues driving this market today to find the best solutions going forward. With our man right in the middle, Barry Saywitz. Hey, Barry.
Hey, good morning, Paul, and good morning to all of our viewers and our listeners out there. If it's Tuesday, we're back here talking real estate, and it is Tuesday, so we are here. Thank you for tuning in and listening in. I am Barry Saywitz, president of the Saywitz Company, managing partner of Saywitz Properties, and if there's one thing that I've learned in my 30-plus years of doing this, it's to look at both sides of the equation, gather the best information you can from experts around you, and try and make an informed decision. And I'm hoping today's show is exactly that. I'm excited for today's show. We have an exciting topic, but before we get going, I do want to do a shout out to all the people out there that have voted, all the people that are going to vote, all the people that are counting the votes, and congratulations in advance to all the winners. It's an important time. It's a challenging environment. Do your thing. Get out there and vote, folks. Thanks. So, for today's show, our topic is fair housing, landlords and tenants, both sides of the equation. Gee, how ironic. And I'm blessed to have with us Denise Cato, the president, CEO of the Fair Housing Council of Orange County, and her right-hand man, David Levy, program specialist and coordinator, both longtime residents of Southern California and Orange County, both longtime experts in fair housing issues, and dealing with all the drama that goes into landlord-tenant relationships. Welcome to the show, guys. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning.
Yeah. So, Denise, I'm going to start with you. I want to, for the folks out there that are not familiar with the Fair Housing Council or the Fair Housing Authority, explain to everybody what exactly the Fair Housing Council is here in Orange County, and then how that relates nationally to folks around the country.
Basically, we investigate housing discrimination complaints. We get funding through CDBG, Community Development Block Grants. Cities that pay us are basically funded to have an organization like ours represent them. And we have several contracts with HUD. We have a PEI grant that's for investigation of housing discrimination, and an EOI grant basically that we use for education, to educate the public of what fair housing is.
Gotcha. And I mean, the average person, at least in my experience, they, as soon as they feel they've been wrong, they raise their hand and say, hey, I'm calling fair housing. And whether that is the right path or the wrong path, I guess, it depends on once they talk to somebody on the other end of the stick. But the general gist of the Fair Housing Council is, from my perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, David, it's a dispute resolution entity, and it is a vehicle for people that feel as though they have been discriminated against to have a place to go to.
I would say not only dispute resolution, perhaps, but dispute prevention, perhaps, also.
Yeah.
What we endeavor to do, both for what I would call housing consumers and housing providers, is to give them straight information about what are their rights and obligations. What does the law say? We try and keep it objective and let people know where they stand. And once we hear their information, get the facts, we can give them some guidance on what they can do next. That could be to resolve a dispute that already exists or to head one off.
Sure, and avoid having to bog down the court system with either frivolous lawsuits or wasting time with an already strained court system. Yeah,
one of the advantages, one of the reasons Denise mentioned the local funding through the Community Development Block Grant, the cities that give us those contracts, they like to be able to refer people to us because otherwise they're calling City Hall.
Sure, sure. Or their council person or their mayor or whoever they can get in touch with, right?
Yeah.
And so, and are there other housing agencies similar to yours throughout the state or nationally, or how does that work? So if I'm in Northern California, I'm in San Diego, I'm in Riverside County, is there a equivalent organization or place for me to go?
There is.
Yeah. So for tenants out there, I mean, if you're listening, right, it's not like you don't have any help, and it's not like you don't have a place to go. I think that the logic would be that if you feel as though you've been wronged or you're in a situation where something's not right, then your first step is to go get that information and figure out if that's really the case or not, and you guys are the place to call.
Yes.
Exactly.
So in terms of the Fair Housing Council, or when people say Fair Housing Authority or Fair Housing, whatever term they use, again, for the folks out there, your organization is not the end-all, be-all of law. If somebody called your office and you said, hey, our take on it is your landlord's right, you're right, or this is how I read it, it doesn't mean that that's how it goes. It's just giving advice and guidance as to how to interpret what's out there and what's happening to you.
Absolutely.
True?
Exactly. We're a nonprofit organization. We have zero authority. Then we get called the Fair Housing Authority on occasions, but we avoid that term.
Right.
And we're a counseling agency foremost, and we provide information. And we're careful not to give legal advice because we're not attorneys.
Well, and so I want to ask you about that. So in terms of process, let's just pick one. I'm a tenant. I feel like my landlord has wronged me. He's raised my rent. He didn't fix something that I asked him to 5 times. I feel like my apartment is not up to code in terms of habitability, any of these things. Or I feel as though I've been treated poorly based on color of skin or any other determining factor. I call you. How does it go? I call into the office, and do I get referred to a specialist, or does someone open a file? David, walk me through kind of what happens.
We have counselors who, and we have services in Orange County available in both English and Spanish. We had services recently, up until we lost an employee, in Vietnamese as well, which are the 2 primary non-English speaking languages.
Sure.
But they're connected with a counselor who gathers information about their situation. We speak primarily to tenants, but not exclusively to tenants. We will talk to landlords and property managers as well. Gather the facts, and then based on those facts as we understand them, and we're clear from our experience that people will tell us their side of the story.
Yeah.
So, there's a little bit of skepticism sometimes, and when we ask questions to try and clarify things like that. And then we can advise the individual on where they stand and what actions they might want to take. We do refer them, for instance, if it's a case where it appears to be serious habitability issues, we can refer them to the local city code enforcement department.
Sure.
And in fact, California had a nice change, in my opinion, a nice change in the law that started July 1st of this year that puts more mandates on code enforcement departments to actually get out and take care of habitability problems in apartments.
Yeah, or a health department if it's that bad, or whatever
Yes.
the case might be. But in terms of advising them on where to go, your focus is on giving them, I guess, general advice on whether they're right or wrong, and then a direction of how to proceed going forward. But you're not writing letters to landlords on tenants' behalf, or are you in some instances actually reaching out to the landlord saying, hey, I think you got a problem?
Well, in certain instances, we describe ourselves as it's a self-help methodology. We give you the information and the suggested tools and ask you to go ahead and take action. If that doesn't work out, you're free to get back in touch with us. But on occasion, given the situation, if we uncover it, we will, in fact, send a letter to a landlord or a management company and pointing out what we think is the problem that they need to resolve.
Yeah, and I've gotten letters from you guys, and then it's always good to hear the other side of the story, because as I've learned in my travels, there's always 2 sides to it, and then once you take in both sides, you can digest kind of where the real story is, if it's one or the other or somewhere in the middle. And then in terms of dispute resolution, is there a scenario, Denise, where you bring landlord and tenant together?
Absolutely. We have a mediation department where we mediate tenant to tenant or landlord to tenant, and that's basically handled in our enforcement department. The things that Dave has basically discussed comes in through our landlord-tenant lines.
Gotcha.
So we're listening to them decide, okay, well, where does this go? If they mention anything that sounds discriminatory, then they're basically transferred to our enforcement department, where people that are trained listen in more depth of what's basically going on. So do we have a mediation? Yes, we would much rather mediate a situation than for it to go into litigation.
Yeah.
And that's where I come in. I work with AGLA, the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles, and Southern Cities Apartment Association, that's in Long Beach and Orange County Apartment Association, and go up as far as Santa Barbara. So I am constantly working with owners, letting them know if there's a problem, let us try to mediate it so it doesn't go further.
Sure. And in those scenarios, is it mostly landlord-tenant issues, or do you get some tenant issues where you got neighbors fighting or arguing and then they feel as though they're discriminated against, and do they come to you for that kind of stuff?
Yes. One of the number one topics now would be, I guess, the LGBT community that we're getting a lot of calls from.
Oh, interesting.
Now, and I would add that and when there is a tenant-to-tenant possible discriminatory animus going on, we do encounter, unfortunately, landlords who think, well, that's their problem and I can stay out of it. And actually, we need to make landlords aware that they don't necessarily get to stay out of it. There is a new California fair housing regulations. California didn't have fair housing regulations until January of 2020. They finally brought around regulations, and they're bringing in additional regulations over time. And one of the ones they've addressed is harassment, and it makes clear that a landlord can have liability if they don't address tenant-to-tenant discriminatory behavior.
And I can tell you from personal experience, certainly as the landlord, you'd like to stay out of it if you could.
Yeah.
But other people's problems all of a sudden become your problems, and then the issue is if it's not solved, it now can grow into other tenants and neighbors and other things. And we've had it across the board from, one family smokes weed out on the patio and the next door neighbor has little kids with asthma problems, and now that is my problem, to somebody made a comment that somebody perceived as discriminatory, and now I feel uncomfortable and I can't go outside in the courtyard, and now what do you do, right? And so it's a challenge. I guess I don't have a better word for it other than it's a challenge, and you've got to navigate through it, and that's why your organization's so helpful in trying to be able to focus people on a solution as opposed to yelling and screaming and arguing and threatening and all those other fun things. So in terms of COVID, I just want to back up for a second. What were the challenges during COVID? I guess, number one, just on your side of getting your own folks to come into work and being able to deal with the challenges of working remotely and trying to deal with all that, but then also just the issue of the perception that from a tenant's perspective, hey, I don't really have to pay my rent, I can do whatever I want, it's COVID, and the California rent relief and all of those other things. Those are, to me, there's a money aspect to sort of disputes, there's a social aspect to the dispute, and then there's the actual personalities of the people involved is kind of how I break it down. On the financial side of things, how did it work during COVID, and what were the challenges then?
The challenges were basically explaining to individuals, pay your rent. That's a necessity. That comes before anything else.
Yeah.
If you can't pay your rent, pay as much as you possibly can, because that's not going to be waived where you don't have to ever pay it.
Yeah, and I think a big perception out there for a lot of people was, hey, I just don't have to pay and it's going to go away, and somebody in Washington's going to wave a magic wand and I'll get freebies. No,
it isn't.
Yeah.
And it's really affected Orange County a lot, because when the moratorium was up on March the 31st, very few tenants were aware that if they didn't pay rent on April the 1st, a landlord could serve them with a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit, and then they could be evicted.
Right.
So our office were over-flooded with tenants coming in wondering, why am I being evicted now?
Right. And landlords just sitting back waiting, going, look, I told you to pay.
Absolutely.
You didn't pay. I can't run a business without you paying. I can't pay my mortgage, so here you go. And then, in our world, on our side as a landlord, the court system then is flooded from all of these financial evictions. And then tenants have, the fallback is, well, okay, it's not about the money. It's about, I have roaches, I have this, I have a habitability issue, I have a discrimination issue. How come you're not evicting my neighbor? He didn't pay. You digress from the real issue, which is if you just paid your rent, you would not be in the situation.
Absolutely. Or try to make arrangements with your landlord to pay your rent.
Or have an open line of communication rather than having somebody hunt you down.
One of the things we always try and make clear when we're counseling clients is that, yes, there may be instances where it is appropriate to say, I'm not paying my rent because the property is not habitable. But there's a process. If that's really the case, there's a process that they should go through. They need to well document the existing conditions that make it not habitable and be able to defend themselves if the landlord says, hey, you didn't pay your rent. Well, they can say, well, I've got a legally accepted reason for not paying my rent because you failed to make the unit habitable. But they've done all the groundwork. They've got the proof that they need to do that, so that if it comes to a court action, they can actually legitimately defend their non-payment.
Yeah.
But what you do get is people who run into a financial difficulty, and then suddenly they think, well, how can I try and cover the fact that I just didn't have the money?
Agreed.
And so one of the important things we tell tenants is, if you have a habitability issue and you choose not to pay the rent, be prepared to show that you always had that money but just chose not to give it to the landlord because of the lack of habitability.
And that you reached out to ask them to address
Right.
whatever the
Yes.
habitability issue
Yeah.
was, and gave the landlord some fair opportunity to address it.
Yeah.
And we've had that in instances, and I mean, I could go all day. It's like a TV show in our office in some instances, but certainly when you get a picture of one cockroach that looks like Godzilla because I took the photo from up close and now I've got an infestation, that in of itself is not enough to warrant breaking my lease and not paying my rent.
Or summer air conditioners going
Right.
out. You can't put that up under habitability.
Right.
It's an amenity. All right. If it's in your contract, then a landlord should prepare it. But would I tell someone to withhold their rent because their air conditioner isn't working? No.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have you work out of our office next summer when it's really hot, because all of our tenants in the desert, when it's 120, as soon as the air conditioning goes down, it's, I want a hotel. And I feel for them. I mean, it's really hot out, but these are sort of acts beyond the landlord's control. And then the problem that we had just on that topic, as a side note, you can't get replacement parts because you have supply chain issues. And then you go, okay, I'm just going to get a new air conditioning unit because I feel bad. I'll spend the money. I'm going to go the extra mile. And I can't get somebody to install it, right? Because they're backed up. And so you run into, and then tenant goes, look, I'm not paying my rent, or I'm just leaving. I'm going to go, I can't. I mean, we had a handful of tenants who just said, look, I'm leaving. I'm just breaking my lease. And I said, please don't do that, right? You'll one day, somebody's going to wind up garnishing your wages. One day you're going to want to go lease a car or rent another place or get a credit card, and it's going to show up on your credit. And I'm not threatening. I'm just telling you that's how the world works.
Absolutely.
It's important, I think, to understand the consequences of any action, not only for a landlord for not fixing or maintaining your apartment, because there's consequences to that, but from the tenant's perspective, there's consequences for not paying your rent and doing what you're supposed to do as well.
And one of the things I like to try and make clear is to differentiate between whether a tenant might feel that they've got some claim where they are entitled to get some of their rent money back, perhaps, versus the right to withhold the rent in the first place.
Yes.
So if they don't have a legitimate reason to not pay the rent, we say pay the rent. But if you then believe that you have some legitimate claim you can bring to get some of that money back, go ahead and bring it. It could be a small claims court matter, and if the judge disagrees, you've lost your filing fee and a bit of your time, but you haven't been evicted into the street because you did the wrong thing.
Right, and it's also important to note that if your rent is $2,000 or $3,000 a month and the toilet is running, that doesn't constitute not paying $2,000 or $3,000.
Exactly.
You could have remedied it with $100 or $200 fix.
Yeah.
And the converse of that is, if you're the landlord and the toilet's running, you should fix it, because you're probably the one paying the water bill, and it's going to kill you at the end of the day anyway.
And you don't want unhappy tenants.
Yeah.
I mean, if you keep your tenants happy, they'll be more than willing to pay the rent, kind of thing. But when you get into a dispute situation where, well, you didn't fix that, I'm going to show you, then things spin out of control.
Yeah, and I find too there's another class of sort of landlords and tenants. There's the landlord who wants to take care of his place, wants to make his tenants happy, because a happy tenant is just happier for everybody. And then if at some point I do need to raise the rent, at least I got some value, and my landlord's a good person, or it's a good company to work with. They weren't jerking me around. Versus the person I call and they just never fix anything, and this is always dirty, or this is never working, or whatever the case is. And then you have the tenant who has stuff in their apartment that doesn't work, and then doesn't say anything because they're afraid that if they say something, the landlord will, the rent will go. So we have that as well, where we go into the apartment to do an inspection, and all of a sudden there's like 4 things. Like, how come we have a website, right? How come you didn't call it in? And then, I don't want you raising my rent. Look at all the stuff that's not working. How about I fix all the stuff that I didn't know about, and then we can have a conversation about the rent. But so, Denise, let's fast forward, right? So with COVID, you've got a different set of issues of landlord-tenant, and now I'm going to call this in the post-COVID era, while COVID's still around, the implications of it relative to the real estate side of it are just not the same. So we're coming out of it. Landlords say, hey, look, you don't pay the rent, you got to go. I'm sorry, I can't run a business that way. tenant doesn't have the rent, tenant didn't know they owed it, put their head in the sand, whatever the case was. Now there's an issue, right? And so now what you're saying is landlord goes to do the eviction, and then tenant comes to you and says, hey, I'm being discriminated against. What can I do? How can I stay? I don't want to move.
First of all, I have to explain to them, why is it discrimination? If it doesn't fall up under one of the protected classes for federal or state, we're talking about for federal, race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, or familiar status, families with children. That's federal.
Right.
If it doesn't fall up under one of those, then it's not discrimination. You not paying your rent
It's not discrimination.
It's not discrimination.
Right.
And that's what most people don't understand. It's a landlord-tenant issue. So what we've been doing more than anything is trying to mediate for them to get more time.
Yeah.
Because
either time to pay or time to move. Right.
And one of the things I counsel clients on a lot is it's not what you say that matters, it's what you can prove that matters. And so it's very important that things be well documented. We constantly have to encourage tenants, do things in writing, leave a record. If you have a phone call conversation, the two people on that conversation can say different things about what was communicated, whereas if it's written down, there's at least a clear record. And ultimately, if you're going to bring a successful claim either for violations of landlord-tenant law or discrimination, you got to have some evidence to show your case.
Yeah.
And so doing things, documenting is a very important part of it on both sides, for the tenants and the landlords.
I agree. I mean, open line of communication, the better off the more you do, the better off you are. And I also believe that the yelling and the screaming and the non-professional acts on both sides of the stick is just not going to get anybody anywhere, right? I mean, it's just not accomplishing your goal. Some people think they yell and scream, maybe somebody will give me what I want, and I don't know. In our office, it doesn't really work. I don't know how it works at all other places, but it has a tendency to backfire, right? You just look irrational, whoever you are. So in terms of today's world, people that are out there that didn't pay their rent, or people that are out there that are trying to get out of their lease because they feel uncomfortable with a discrimination issue or with a neighbor or with a landlord. Now the problem is the real estate market's very tight, right? And so now I have very limited opportunities to move to. Chances are the place I'm going to move to is going to be more expensive than the place that I'm in. And while it might be a better fit or a different set of circumstances, I still have a challenge of looking elsewhere to go do something different, which gets back to, if there is a financial piece to it, just makes it even tougher. And so what do you tell folks in terms of once they realize or come to grips, or your folks realize, look, this tenant cannot stay, right? They don't either have the money or the landlord's unwilling to keep them. You've got to go to plan B. What's the advice there for the tenant?
Well, my thing is, first, we try to do everything to make sure they can stay. But if for some reason they can't, then they're going to have to try to find a place. But what I tell people more than anything, don't give those notices that you're going to vacate before you have a place, because those landlords are renting the places from up under you, and they don't have to allow you to stay there, and it's not discrimination. And that's the problem that we're having. People are giving notices basically saying, I'm going to be out of here in 30 days. Well, where are you going to go?
Right. And the old days of, if the market was soft or there was a for rent sign at the property next door, as a tenant, you could either make that threat or you could actually do it. Like, we would have tenants and they'll be like, wait a minute, you moved across the street? How did that happen? But today it's not so easy. And then if you have marks on your credit because you didn't pay some of your bills during COVID, now the new landlord looks at your credit even more tightly than they did before, because they don't want to get in a situation where they're renting to someone who can't pay going forward and be back where they were before.
And there's also just a cash flow issue. You need money to move into the new place, but your old landlord doesn't have to account for your security deposit until 21 days after you vacate.
Yes.
So, you got to figure out how to bridge that. So yeah, we try and make it clear to people, don't just, do something spur of the moment and then come to regret it. We give them all the details, and then that's their choice to make, obviously, but that's how we try and counsel the people who call us.
Yeah, and what we tell our tenants is, look, we're coming to you early, because we want to know if you want to stay, we want to know if you want to move, we want to know if you have the capacity to pay, or if you've had a change in circumstances, because if it's going to be something other than, well, whatever we're doing, right, we just need a plan. And then people go, well, it's too early. No, it's not too early.
No,
right?
It's never too early.
It's not too early, right? And then I would just say, if you're a tenant, right, I believe that the rental market is going to continue to go up because the housing market is almost shut down because of higher interest rates. So almost no one is going to buy a house, which means that less people are moving around. And the only opportunities that come out in the rental market are landlords getting rid of bad tenants who then theoretically would fix up the place and charge higher dollar
rent.
So your opportunities are limited. The rents that you're going to pay out there are going to be higher. And so it's just a challenge for the tenant, right? If you want to stay, I would say go to your landlord early. If it was me, I'd go to my landlord and say, look, I'd like to make a deal. Or we have tenants that say, I'd like to do a 2 or a 3-year lease. Can I lock in the price? Some landlords will do it because that's security of longevity. Others say, no, I'll see where the world is in a year and we'll reevaluate. But either way, waiting to the end, I got to just say, bad strategy. I mean, David?
Yeah, I mean, people need to be thinking ahead and not getting themselves into a situation where now it's a desperation that they've got to act or be acted upon, one of the two. If a tenant has a short-term problem, one of the things I suggest is, well, if you think you're going to be able to bring yourself current, maybe there is a deal to be made, because if the landlord does take you to court and does evict you, they don't get money from you. They get a judgment that they then have to try and chase. So there might be a way to work it out if it's a short-term problem. Obviously, if it's a long-term problem, this is not an affordable place for you anymore. You've got to reconsider how you're going to figure out your housing.
Right. If you're in a 2-bedroom, you need a 1-bedroom. If you're living in one city, maybe you need to go to a different place. I mean, that's an affordability issue at the end of the day. I mean, the other thing, too, is that in terms of new leases, right? So sometimes we'll have tenants that will come in, they will apply for a unit, and then they're denied. They're either denied because of their credit, they're denied because they don't have the right amount of income to justify paying the rent, and then the tenant says, hey, you discriminated against me because of X, Y, Z, right? And that one is a tricky one for a landlord, and I'm sure you get some of those calls as well. Denise, how do those go, and how do they differ from?
It's a lot of calls that come in that I'm discriminated against because my source of income. Well, California is one of the states that cover source of income. You cannot deny a person that's on Social Security or unemployment or disability. A person might not qualify for the unit because their income is not sufficient enough. But for you to say, I don't take people on a county, you can't do that.
Right.
Nor can you now say you don't take Section 8.
Right.
A person might not qualify because their voucher isn't significant enough for your unit. But for you to say, I'm not renting to people on Section 8, then you are discriminating.
Yeah. From a landlord's perspective, it's, hey, if you're supposed to make, our rule is 2 or 3 times the income and you're not there, then that would be the reason. And then people come back and say, hey, that's
their criteria,
right,
as long as they're doing across the board.
Right. Or if you have really horrible credit and you've stiffed a whole bunch of other people, whether it's COVID related or goes back further than that, it's also a source of big heartache for a landlord to try and take a risk on somebody, which is why you don't want to stiff your landlord, right? And you certainly don't want it on your credit, right? It's better to work out a deal, have some sort of a settlement agreement, which is what we tell our tenants. Look, I'd rather settle with you, sign a termination, and then you don't get sued and you don't owe me any money. And then when you go tell the new landlord, you just say, hey, look, the lease was up, we terminated it, right? Better than my landlord was threatening to sue me and throw me out.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I told you we'd go quick. We are getting down to the wire. We could talk all day. Section 8's probably a whole nother show or two, I'm certain. But in terms of just general advice for landlords and tenants out there, David, to the tenant, what's the short answer of?
Again, I think it's important that tenants understand, do things in writing, document, understand your rights and obligations, get advice if you're uncertain. Don't dig yourself into a hole, and then we get the call when the person's already been served the unlawful detain or eviction action, and had they called us a month before, we may have headed that off. So document and seek help early, I'd say, for tenants.
Yeah, and Denise, for landlords?
I would basically say that education, we don't know everything, but if you need assistance, you need fair housing training, we're more than willing to provide it, because I'm a firm believer that if you know what the law basically says, it's better business for everyone.
Of course. And I would just say, whatever you're doing, landlord or tenant, start early. Better communication is better, and more communication is better than not, so that everybody's at least on the same page in terms of understanding what the other side's trying to do. So in terms of how people can reach you, David, David, what's the website or the phone number or both?
Website is fairhousingoc.org. We also take inquiries by email, which is info, I-N-F-O, at fairhousingoc.org. And, of course, by the telephone, which is the vast majority of the contacts we get. And our number is 714-569-0823. For landlord tenants, you'd select prompt number 4.
Got it. Well, there you have it. I appreciate both of you coming on
Thank you.
sharing your insights, and appreciate what you do on a daily basis for the community and for landlords and tenants out there. For me, I'm Barry Saywitz, president of the Saywitz Company. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening in again today. I want to thank all the folks here at OC Talk Radio for putting it all together. Get out and vote. If it's Tuesday, we're talking real estate. We'll see you back here next week. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. You've been listening to Let's Talk Real Estate, your weekly BS with Barry Saywitz about the current state of the real commercial real estate market right here in Southern California. On Orange County's only community radio station, OC Talk Radio, streaming live from our studio here at the University of California Irvine's Beale Applied Innovation Center.